certified about 2 years ago. I've been doing genealogy though for about, I don't know, 45 years, something like that, since I was a kid. Always been a nut about it. Actually was already interested in it, and Roots came out, and you know how everybody went crazy on genealogy after Roots. As you know, our theme today is family history genealogy, and I list both because some people call it one, some call it another. Yeah, because I kind of differentiate between genealogy and family history a little bit. I have always said that genealogy is more the scientific study, where you're learning whose parents are whose parents and all their kids and all that stuff. And the family history part of it, to me, is the stories behind all those people and the collection of the stories in addition to the technical aspects of genealogy. So it's more than about just gathering names and dates and places, though that's the important aspect of it. But you also want to understand that you need to find out who they are, what they were doing, why they were doing it, that sort of thing. There's a lot of different family lore and stuff. You need to explore that, find out if it's true and how you can verify it, but also how you can enhance that story that you already have. It's the second biggest hobby in the US. Gardening, I think I heard, was the largest one, and then genealogy after that. And I'd like to think genealogy's catching up with gardening. Not a big vegetable eater. So today we're going to be talking about an array of different things. I'm going to be just hitting the high points of all the different aspects of genealogy. If you would like me to stop and clarify anything, please let me know. I do tend to ramble on though, so I'm going to try to press on and get through in an hour. So if I give a brief answer and then keep going, forgive me. I will leave time at the end though that we can all have a discussion. I don't think they have anything planned in here at one. So, but we'll be talking about determining your approach, how to structure your tree, how to start your research, where to find the different elements that you need to verify ancestry. Talk about some places where you can get resources and information. I'm going to cover pretty extensively some of the pitfalls and myths and legends, because those are things that can trip people up a lot. People get lost sometimes in stories, and they take them all for granted that it's all true. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about exploring your DNA and how that works, what value it brings to your genealogy, to your family history. So, question, how many of you have done a family history in the past, have been working on your genealogy? Most, about 2/3 of the group have worked in some aspect of theirs. This is going to be from the beginning kind of approach, but maybe we can all learn something from it. Anyway, planning ahead can get you started on the right foot. You want to be able to say, okay, I'm getting started on this and I want to do it right. So you don't have to go back and correct mistakes down the road or add information that you weren't keeping in the same format, that kind of thing. So you want to first figure out, what am my goals? Am I strictly working on just a pedigree chart where I say this is me, these are my parents, grandparents, their parents on back? Or do you want to look more into the family narrative and add that to the other element? Paper or digital? Old school, we used to have to start out with a sheet of paper, a pedigree chart, a family group chart, and we'd write it all down by hand. Unless you knew how to type, and then you had to line up all the lines. It was a mess. Computers really simplified things. And I think you'll see that the numbers of people you can actually start dealing with pretty quickly would justify doing it digitally. Whether that's on a computer top, on your software that's on your computer, or online. Either approach, but I would suggest that that's where you should probably be going, because it can get real confusing real fast. I was gonna bring in a couple of binders I did for my grandmother's 90th birthday party. I did her ancestry, just a pedigree chart, this is her, these are her parents, their parents, going back. And I had 2 binders that thick that I had to print out, just that. It didn't have the family sheets, it didn't have any information about the people, nothing. And if I didn't have that on a computer and could hit print, it would have been a disaster trying to put that together, so anyway, how to structure your research, how to understand where you're looking for things, how you're gonna document what you've found, where you're gonna keep that, how you store your records and your photos. I have folders on my desktop that I store those things in, and I have a very systematic way of putting things into family folders and that sort of thing. So this is all forethought stuff that you can do before you get too deep into the weeds and you have to go back and reinvent it all. It's really helpful to have that pause at the beginning to think, okay, where do I want to go with this, and how do I want to structure my research? And do it with a plan for growth. Right now you might have 3 or 4 generations, but I'll show you what happens when you start getting a little further into it. When you start a tree, you start with yourself. Then you add your parents. So you have 2 parents and 4 grandparents. But then that number starts to double every generation. And you can see, by the time you're at your 3rd great-grandparents, you're dealing with 32 people in a single line of your family tree, which represent 32 families before them. But then you go to their parents, and now you're at 64. And that number keeps growing exponentially. And you can see what happens as you start getting further and further and further back in your tree.
And you're related to everybody.
Your 18th great-grandparents. There are over 1 million people in that single line, representing over 1 million families in the generation before. And if you go to the 19th, it's well over 2 million. The 20th, it's about 4.5 million. So you can see why I would suggest having an organized system and having a computer-based software of some kind that you can put it into. 18th great-grandparent sounds crazy, but that's about 500 years, roughly. That's about 450 to 500 years ago, which isn't really undoable. For most people. I have several strands of mine that I've gotten back that far. Some, dead ends that you just don't come anywhere close to that, but it's very doable. And one thing I would say, though, about that number, 1,081,000, that would be if they were all unique individuals. We have to understand that as you go back, some of your family lines are going to reconnect because people, several generations down the road would marry into a 4th cousin or a 3rd cousin or, something like that. And then the trees kind of come back together. So there probably aren't over 1 million individuals on that tree. But that would represent how many 18th great-grandparents you have. So when you start your research, look at the stuff you already have. Look at your records. You're starting with yourself, then adding your parents. So what do you have? Do you have a birth certificate on hand? Do you have your baptismal information, your first communion, marriage records, births of your children? Those kind of things that you already have on hand, that you can document, that you can add those files into their record as you go. And then look at your parents. What do you have for them? Probably something about when they got married. Probably something about when they died, or if they're still living, about when they were born, that kind of thing. You want to look at what you have available already. That goes for photographs, scrapbooks, military documents, whatever you have on hand. That's the best starting point because you know that those records are true and that those can be, within a certain amount of error, can be expected to be accurate. And then you enter that information into some basic documents. I mentioned a pedigree chart earlier. And this is your pedigree chart. Most of you will recognize this. This is where you list yourself, your parents, your grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. And then when you get to the great-grandparents, you start another chart for each one of them, where they're this person, and then it keeps going, and you number the charts. If you have software, you don't have to worry about adding charts and moving people around on different pieces of paper and stuff, because it can get really confusing. The pedigree chart is probably the most basic element of your family tree, whether you're doing it on paper or online or digitally. The pedigree chart's the most common place to work from. It lists all the different generations of your tree, and you can go back and see all the great-grandparents at the same time, all the second great-grandparents at the same time, that sort of thing. It takes a lot of shapes. That was your basic pedigree chart, but there's also a fan chart that's really beautiful. There's ones that look like trees. There's all kinds of different things, but that is your basic document that you work from. The other thing you'll want to put together is a family group sheet. Now, each person would have their own sheet with their spouse and then their children. I cut this off, but there's sometimes pages of children, especially if you get back into the 19th century and earlier. It gives the names of their parents, it gives the names of other marriages, all that stuff. So this is where you put the detail for each individual family. And this is where you can also track collateral lines for your family. Because your parents had siblings, and you can see them on the family group sheet. And if you can't find something, maybe one of their families has that information. Maybe one of their families has put that information online already. So if you have a third great-grandparent and you're trying to find out more information about their parents, maybe one of their siblings has a third great-grandkid that has that information, and you can track that way. Anything you can do to try to track down the information, and the more people you have tied to your tree, easier that gets. So it documents the entire family. It tracks the growth and movement of the family, because you can look sometimes, kind of like in a census record, you can look at the names of all the children, their ages, and where they were born. Sometimes you'll have a couple kids born in New York, and the next kid's in Ohio, then the rest of the kids are in Iowa. And you can track, based on the year they were born, the motion of that family, the movement of that family as they did that immigrant thing, that pioneer thing across the country. And like I said, calling a sibling can help lead you back to the information in the direct line. Okay, I like to say there's 3 kinds of research today. There didn't used to be. Today there are. It's kind of a stool, a 3-legged stool approach to research. Traditional research, one of them we're standing in, the library. Here they have old newspapers, they have some family histories that have been written and donated. They have microfilm, they have a lot of different resources like that. This library in particular also has a free subscription to Ancestry.com that you can come in and use if you aren't a subscriber to it. You can't go into your tree on it, because then it logs out the library and logs you in. But you can go on it and use it as a research tool and find documents and things that you can't get if you're not a paid member. And you can put in a thumb drive and save those documents to your thumb drive. So it would allow you to actually access some of the items that are in Ancestry that you can't get without a paid subscription. Government offices, of course, Register of Deeds, looking for birth certificates, land records, court records. We have people, excuse me, there's people who don't think that they're going to show up in court records, but they're only thinking of a criminal. There were a lot of civil actions too, land sales, wills, probate records. You have, even if your ancestor didn't have a will or a probate, they might have been named in somebody else's. So it's always good to be able to look at those kind of records and see what you can find. Having conversations with your family. Excuse me, I have a little scratchy throat. Reaching out to the individuals in your family who have that information or don't even know they have information sometimes. Asking key questions. Pulling that memory out of them that they didn't know they had. Sometimes just getting them talking. That's the biggest thing. And then asking prompt questions to say, hey, what was Christmas like back when you were a kid? And that gets them started. Then they start talking about who came to Christmas every year and how that worked and where they came from and that kind of stuff. So, and then the old school writing letters, more efficiently nowadays, emails. It's a lot faster, trust me. I used to write letters to cousins, aunts and uncles, and send them the pedigree chart and the family group sheet and ask them to fill it out for each person in the family and mail it back, and it was months in the works, Now you can send an email and you hear back in a day or two usually. So that's traditional research. Then we look at online research. That's the second leg. This, of course, has changed the way we do genealogy. It really has. And most of you that are working on your genealogy, I'm sure you've been online and had a chance to look at some of the things that are there. It's limitless in many ways, but keep in mind that just because you don't find it online doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Not all records are online. As a matter of fact, even though there are literally billions and billions of records online, there's a lot of stuff that's not online yet, unless somebody sat down, digitized it, and put it into a database somewhere. So, it could still be out there, but more records are constantly being added too. So if you've been online and looked for something, go back periodically and look again, because it might be there. You explore the obvious places, Ancestry.com, Family Search, and we can talk about what those are specifically after we're done with the presentation, because I don't know how long I'm going to talk. Fold 3, which is owned by Ancestry, but it has military records primarily. Newspapers.com, again, owned by Ancestry. It's a paid subscription. But then the National Archives as well. Everything there is free, unless you have to make a copy and they have to send it to you, and you pay a fee for that. But they have their own newspaper database called Chronicling America. It's really helpful. And it's just endless, the number of resources that are online. And finding them can, sometimes you struggle, and sometimes you hit a jackpot like right off the bat. And then think outside the box. It doesn't have to be a genealogy site or a records domain of some kind. I use a lot of things with strategic Google searches, using Boolean logic, and trying to find things. Online books are huge, especially if you're looking at maybe, let's say, a Civil War veteran, and you know what unit they were a member of. Well, you can go online and you can find if there was a unit history written about that. And it might not mention your ancestor in it, but it's going to say every step of the war and what battles they were in, where they camped, how long they were there, that kind of thing. So there's just, again, endless research available, and it is so much fun just to sit and do it. This is going to be my first time saying this, but not my last. Just be careful to evaluate the quality of the information you're finding. People put things online, claim it means this and it means that, and believe it or not, you can't trust everything you hear on the internet, okay? So, be careful what you look on the internet. Try to find the original document if you can. If somebody has a quote from a book, go to the book and then find the book online and see if it says that or what the context is, what it says before and after that, so that you know that it wasn't just cherry-picked and lifted to paint a picture, so to speak. So check those sources online. Look for the original resource rather than somebody else's interpretation of it. Okay, how do we trust that research then? And was just kind of hitting on this. I got ahead of myself. Don't believe what you read or find on the internet to be your ancestor just because someone says it. Prove that information. And you'll find this a lot on, say, Family Search, Ancestry, those where they have people's family trees. You know, you'll find a hit for your ancestor and it'll have parents there and you don't have the parents. Well, don't just add them. Go in, see what documents they've attached to that person. See where they got the information that said this is the parent of your ancestor. So that you're not just copying bad information, moving it over and infecting your own tree with this disease. Ancestry should have 2 or more reliable documents tied to a person to prove parentage or their existence, that sort of thing. So we're looking at maybe a marriage record that tells the names of the couple getting married, tells their parents' names, that kind of thing. You know, so we try to look for at least 1, preferably 2, before you say, okay, this is that parent group or their child or something. When you are researching, document your sources. You want to make sure, 1, that you know where you got that information. But 2, that if other people come and question you about it, that you can say, this is where I got it. And this is why I believe it to be true. It helps when you ever need to go back and find it again. If you say, oh, I used that census record, but I didn't look to see who the neighbors were. Maybe they live next door to relatives. Well, now you know where you found that, and you can go back and look at it again. So document your sources. Be a copycat. People have all kinds of stuff on there. They have photographs, documents, records, that kind of thing. Pick it up, put it in your tree, if it fits, and document it so that you know where you got it, and so that you give them credit, you know, for being the ones that sourced that information. Record information you don't find. If you're looking on a website and you go through a whole body of burial records that aren't indexed, so you have to look at every burial record, and you go through a whole cemetery and it's not there. Well, you want to write that down, because a year from now you're doing another Google search and the cemetery pops up. You want to remember, oh, I already looked there. I don't want to spend an hour and a half looking through 1,500 burial records for this cemetery again when I know it wasn't there. And then give credit where credit is due. If you do copy other people's information, give them a thumbs up so that people know that you got help. Okay, when you're recording your information online, these are a couple practices I use. I think having your own system is great, but using it consistently is important. For one, I take the name of all my direct ancestors and I type the full name in capital letters. All the siblings and everything just have the first initial, capitalized, Robert Miller or whatever. The R and the M would be capitalized. If Robert Miller's my direct ancestor, it would say all in caps, Robert Miller. It doesn't seem like a necessary thing, but you get into your tree very far, several generations back, and you start trying to back your way out of it. You look at the list of all the kids and you're like, which one of those was my ancestor again? Well, now you know because it's in capital letters. It jumps out at you. Also, when you're doing a search for a person's name and you're searching Robert Miller, I made that name up, it's not in my tree. And you get 3 Robert Millers that are in your tree. The one that's capitalized is your ancestor. So you can click on that and go right to it, rather than clicking on all 3 and trying to figure out which one, because sometimes they're cousins or dad and son and that kind of thing. So I do all capital letters. Other people do things like an asterisk next to the name or whatever. And I don't like adding extra characters if I don't have to. So for me, capitalizing the names are what works best for me. So use maiden names. Women have been ignored enough in history. We need to recognize that they existed, that they participated, that they were half of history, If you know the maiden name, and that if is a real reality. There's a lot of times where the wives were just listed as Mrs. John Jones, you know, and that's all you have. Or his wife Mary, but they don't say the maiden name or anything. And that's where it gets kind of weird. You don't have a maiden name, but you don't want to just put Mary. You want to say, you know, a last name. So I usually put Mrs. in small letters, and then the capital Mary Jones or whatever her married name would be, just so that I know that's a married name. It says Mrs. in front of it. And then I try to find a maiden. Plus that gives you access to a whole other family if you have a maiden name. Now you have their parents and so on. I practice something with how the dates are recorded. Outside the US, most countries do day, month, year, rather than month, day, year. They go from the smallest unit to the largest. So that's how most of the software out there works, because it's international in most cases, and they do put things down by the day, month, and year. So I try to follow the practices that, you know, are most consistent with the rest of the community. Recognize changes to locations, borders, and that kind of thing. The names of communities would change sometimes. Boundaries of counties would change. Territories became states. There became multiple territories, that sort of thing. Know how you want to address that, because for instance, you know, a lot of people type out that something happened in Boston, Middlesex County, Massachusetts, United States of America. But if it happened in 1730, it wasn't the United States of America. So I take that off and I put colonial America on there. That's just how I do it. Some people prefer to say USA and have it with the current designation. I want to go with the designation it was when they were there. So when the action happened, whether it was a birth or a death or something.
Mark,
Yeah.
I'd like to say something about that date, you know, where you say date, month, and year. Definitely put the month in numbers.
No.
Because I have written to some relatives and asked them for dates. And I always use the day first and then the month. And they came back with a lot of the first day, and, you know, and you get one like that's, say, August 10th,
Yeah.
8/10. Is it 10/8 or is it 8/10?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you are reaching out to people for records, say, you know, write the name of the month, or this is the format I'm using, or something.
Yeah, because
Good idea.
it could be real confusing.
Along with that's the calendar. The calendar changed during colonial times. We originally were on the old, I think it was the Gregorian calendar, and it started in March instead of January. And most countries switched to January 1st in the 1500s, but all the countries tied to England, they were at the time in separating themselves from all the Catholic nations, and they didn't want to adhere to what the church said were changes in the calendar. So they retained the old style. So a lot of times you'll find the wrong year attached to somebody who was born in February. You'll say, you know, 1732, and you know it to be 1733. Or you'll find it in one record as 1732 and another in 1733. Well, that's because they didn't change it till, I believe, 1752 is when they finally recognized January 1st as the start of the new year. So you will find records sometimes that'll say 1732/33, and that just means they were in that nebulous January 1st to, I think it was March 15th or something range. So calendar changes. Who would have thought? Find your own system to be consistent. That's the main thing there. How you're gonna, you know, type in names, how you're gonna type in places, dates, that sort of thing. Stories and anecdotes, these are great. And these are just the most wonderful thing when you find a good story about one of your ancestors, about your parent, your grandparent, whatever it is. Family reunions are great times for that. Take your little tape recorder along and ask those loading questions again. So who remembers going to Grandpa's house on the 4th of July, you know? And just let them start talking. That is gold. Talk with as many people as you can, not just relatives, but maybe neighbors, people that live near them, or people that were in business with them, that kind of thing. They'll have great stories and information as well. Just verify those stories. There's bad information out there, and I'll be giving you an example of it pretty soon, of a story from my own family tree, okay? People have stories. It doesn't mean they're maliciously trying to lie. It's just how they heard it. And then it's kind of like that game of telephone that you used to do. Through passage, it just disappears, the true story, and you're off on another direction. Yes, ma'am?
I won't give you an example, but I wanted to tell you, my sister and I did quite a little bit of research on my mother's side of the family. And we ended up calling her, but we already knew this, that she was the reconfiguration queen of the universe. And I really wanted that on her gravestone, but the rest of the family wouldn't.
They vetoed you, huh?
But she twisted the stories, that we had enough information, but then she turned it into something that was not true, but it made her and her family look better. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And she did it with us as we were growing up,
And
so
I'll
it
tell-
wasn't just the past.
Oh, I know, and people and families do that. And I'll tell you what, those Victorians in particular, and you guys that have heard me speak before, you know that I'm always hard on the Victorians, because they didn't let truth stand in the way of a good story. They were all about family honor and, you know, who you came from and all that sort of thing. So that period of time led to a lot of embellishments and a lot of just out and out bad information. I didn't want to say lies, but it's true.
It's true,
lies.
it's true.
So,
It's lies.
anyway, make sure you verify the stories, and we'll talk about how I've done that in the past. Here's some do's to avoid your pitfalls. Do flesh out all your family lore and stories. There are threads of truth in every word of it, but it's been rewoven into a different garment at some point. So make sure you follow each thread individually. Keep digital copies of all your records. Even if and I have a full membership on Ancestry.com. I have the whole package. It's expensive, but I don't think it's so expensive that relative to my interest. People have hobbies. If it's fishing, hunting, gardening, quilting, whatever it is, they spend money on those hobbies. I spend money on this. This is my hobby. So I can justify my Ancestry membership there. But if I ever decided to quit my active membership, the documents that I have attached to each person in the family that came from Ancestry would disappear. And I wouldn't have them anymore. So I copy all of them, I put them in folders on my desktop, my family history folders. And I have one for each family and individual people in there and stuff. So keep copies of your records. Find the stories, not just the documents. Those are where the real color come into your family history. Track women's stories where possible. I say where possible, again. A lot of times it just doesn't exist. But if you know that a man's record says he was married to so-and-so and they had 12 children and 6 of them died in their youth, that was the mother's story too, not just the man's, okay? Recognize your sources, share your discoveries. It doesn't help anybody if you hoard information and keep it to yourself. Put it on your family tree, put it out there. Because somebody's gonna see that, it's gonna help their tree, but they might come back to you and say, hey, I had another photograph just like that one, here it is. So, it can boomerang back at you. And keep an open mind, don't get so tunnel vision on a story. And, well, my grandmother was horrible about this. She grew up here in Sturgis. She had her way of just, these are the stories. My dad told me this, and that's all there is to it. And I disprove them. And she'd say, oh, that's nice, and then she'd just go on and tell the story. She would not listen. And you'll find people online that do that. When you put information out there, they'll say, no, that's not true. That's not how I heard it. My story that I heard has to be true. Don't be that way, okay? And I have that on my don'ts. So anyway, don't get caught up in poor research. We've discussed that. Don't get trapped by spelling. People did not have a uniform way of spelling until at least the mid-19th century. You know, when Webster started coming out with his dictionary and stuff. And people spelled their names phonetically. If they didn't know how to spell it, they spelled it how it sounded. And you'll find crazy spellings of names. You know, some people say, no, that can't be related because we spell our Smith with a Y. Well, some people spell it with a Y, some people spell it with an I. Some people didn't know how to write, and somebody else wrote it down for them. And they didn't know how to spell it, so they just sounded it out. During colonial times, and even back into the Tudor era, they loved adding Y's and E's everywhere in names. So you'll find these crazy spellings that have multiple extra letters and stuff. It's the same family. Again, it's that tunnel vision. Don't say, this is how my family spells it, so it's not true. My family is Wolf with 2 F's. Well, that's fairly recent, I guarantee you. Okay? So, don't lock in on family lore and myth. We've kind of discussed that a little bit already. Use it, document it, but don't take it as the Bible. You know, don't say this is how it was and how it has to be. Be willing to allow yourself to move within certain parameters. Don't forget people were product of their times, okay? And this kind of goes down to some of the other ones, modern sentimentalities, applying motives. Just remember, people were a product of their times. There were crazy ideas out there. They had different thoughts on race, religion. They had different thoughts on morality. They had all kinds of things. And that was how society believed. And that was how they were raised. So we want to document that, but don't try to sweep it under the rug and say, oh, no, they had slaves, but they were the good slaveholders. You know, that kind of thing. They had slaves. That was the era they lived in, okay? We aren't proud of it, but we don't hide it. And we don't try to moralize about it. Some people will add modern sentimentalities or apply motives. They will take something that happens and say, oh, well, if they did that, they must have had a good reason. Maybe this happened, and then they did that. Well, now you're making up a story. You know, just don't do it. One thing, like modern sentimentalities, we today, death is a much, much bigger deal than it used to be before the Victorian era, to be honest with you. Darn Victorians. Child mortality was over 40% through most of our history, well into the 19th century, most of the way through the 19th century. Child mortality, over 40%, almost half of all children didn't live to adulthood. Most of them dying as infants. Now, that would have been tragic. Our great-great-great-grandparents would have felt that loss. But they grew up in a society where that loss was more expected. If they lost 5 of 12 children, that's to be expected. They would grieve, but they would move on pretty quickly. And we would turn around now and say, oh, they must have been devastated. How could she go on? How could he go on? And it's like, they did, because that's what they knew. They were a product of their times, and that had been the reality for thousands of years at that point. You know, that kind of thing happens. So let's not try to apply modern sensibilities to that. And don't try to hide unflattering stories. I found one in my wife's family. I was afraid to tell her dad about it because his dad, I found out, was married to 2 women at once. And I told her dad about it, and he thought it was amazing. He thought it was the coolest story. He's like, where did you find this out? Show me the proof, this is great. I mean, not that he thought that was a good thing, but he was glad to know it. He was glad to know it, and he just thought it really added to the whole color of his dad's story. So, myths and legends, these things come up in every family. Don't be ashamed if one of these sounds familiar, because I guarantee you, your family has had one of these in their narrative. Surnames were changed to Ellis Island. That didn't happen. They would take the names off of the register, the manifest of the ship, and they'd copy them over. How it was listed, now it might have happened at the other end or something, but how it was listed on the ship's manifest is how they listed it here. They would copy it on the name, and they'd have an interpreter there. Now if the person changed their name on their own, anglicized it or something like that, made it easier to the American sensibilities, American tongue, that was on them. People like to pick out that some random government bureaucrat did that to them. This is not true. So go ahead.
Question. I've read that many times and I just doesn't sit right with me
Mhm.
because I'm wondering, suppose they couldn't read, suppose that E was an A
Mhm.
and they put it down as an A when it was really
Right.
an E, so the
And I'm
name
sure
could
those
get
happen.
changed.
Yeah. Inadvertent changes, yeah. But for the most part, you know, they had the people there that spoke that language doing the documents.
But they didn't do that.
And they, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there were probably mistakes that occurred, but for the most part, how it was written down by the person bringing them on the ship is how it was written down when they arrived here. And then if they decided at some point to simplify the name or change the spelling or something, they did it. Another is we can't be related, we spell our name different. I kind of already addressed that one. A huge myth. We descend from a Cherokee princess. There is no such thing as a Cherokee princess. Native American culture didn't have a higher or a familial structure like that, where they had a chief and they were the king and their daughters were princesses, that sort of thing. It just didn't exist. Usually the daughters have something that they're trying to hide in their family tree. That they have maybe a little bit of Native American blood, maybe they have some African American blood, and they want to justify the, you know, the tone of their skin or something. They usually try to make it a Cherokee princess because they were considered the civilized tribes. There was a real popularity too in the late Victorian era, of course, to have kind of the romance of having Native American blood.
Yeah.
So there's multiple reasons that could be there, but most of the people who say that and then do their DNA find there's no Native American blood. My own family had that, only ours was an Ojibwa princess. So, and it wasn't true. Courthouse burned and records are gone. Some courthouses did get burned, you know, during the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, War of 1812, but for the most part, that didn't happen a lot. And if those records got burned, there's usually some other avenue you could take. You know, if the courthouse got burned and birth records are gone, check baptismal records for the churches in town. That sort of thing. So there's ways around it. There's two of them here that kind of go together. It's a family crest and we had a family castle. They don't work that way. Family crests were given to a crest was given to an individual, not to a family. Sometimes the family, if, you know, this earl died and his son became the earl, they'd take the crest and get it assigned onto them, or they'd add another quarter to it to recognize their mother or whatever. But just because there's a crest with your last name on it doesn't mean it's your crest. That's not how they work. 3 brothers came to America. That one I've heard in my own family, and I've heard it in a lot of other people's families that have asked me to help with research. It's always 3 brothers, it's not 2, it's not 5, 4, it's 3. They came to America together, one stayed, one went south, one disappeared into the west and was never heard from again. That's always how it goes. The only variation is sometimes the one that disappeared in the west disappears at sea. But same story. So I think that is really just them trying to justify why there's people of the same surname is there, scattered in different parts of the country, and trying to tie them together into a neat package, so. My ancestor was on General Washington's staff, and there's a lot of variations of that too. Civil War variations and, that kind of thing, but everybody loves having somebody famous in their tree, or at least parallel to somebody famous where they had somebody on their staff. General Washington didn't have tens of thousands of people on his staff. And all of them are known to history. So I'm going to give you a little example here of how a myth like that can arise. Mine is not based on General Washington's staff, it's meant on General Grant's staff in the Civil War. This is my third great-grandfather, Hugh Caden, came from Ireland in 1840, before the potato famine. Served in the Civil War, and after, generations, the story I got from my grandmother, and I've talked to cousins on our Deering side, on the Lindstrom side and everything, they all heard the same story, was that he served on General Grant's staff. He was a major, served on General Grant's staff. He was taken prisoner, was injured and taken prisoner by the Confederates, and served in a POW camp. He finally was released at the end of the war, but suffered such horrible health conditions, couldn't remember who he was, he wandered for a long time, finally remembered and made his way back home, and then was just a wreck the rest of his life. Well, I took each thread of that and started breaking it down. This is the one my grandmother continued to tell even after I showed this to her. This is him again, right after the war. He served as a private in the 9th New York Heavy Artillery. He was in the war, but he wasn't a major on General Grant's staff. He spent much of his service in the hospital. He was injured at the Wilderness, and then he also had gout and chronic dysentery, which were horrible killers in the Civil War. He ended up getting discharged from service shortly before the war ended. And then he went home and resumed his normal life. He did end up getting a little bit of a disability later in life for his gout, but it doesn't marry at all with what the family story is, okay? This is a great story by itself. Why do you need to embellish that? He was in the Civil War, he served in a great unit, he fought at Battle of the Wilderness, injured. That's an impressive story. Why does he have to be a major on General Grant's staff? So I started digging. And I started looking. This is my grandmother. She's the one that told me the story. This is her great-grandfather on her dad's side. So I looked at her grandfather on her mom's side. On the top there, that's Watsontown. He was a very distinguished guy. He worked for the railroad. He was mayor of a town in Iowa. He ended up being the judge in Valentine, Nebraska, the latter part of his life till he died. And then below him is his brother, Luciantown. Now, Watson served in a unit in the Civil War from Illinois, a cavalry unit that got nicknamed McClellan's Dragoons early in the war because they were an escort for McClellan when he'd ride from camp to camp and stuff. He was and I'm reaching here, but this is all I can come up with where that other story came from. McClellan was the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He fell on disfavor. He was booted out as that. And he ended up running for president against Lincoln. And people didn't really like McClellan. But at the end of the war, who was the commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac? General Grant. So I think General Grant got slipped in there instead of McClellan. And that instead of being just part of the escort for him, he became one of his aides. His brother Lucian was taken POW and served in Andersonville Prison. And of course, we've all heard of Andersonville Prison and the horrors that the people there suffered. And I have copies of his application for disability and his narrative of what he suffered there, and then the narratives of multiple people who were with him that he added to it in order to justify his, disability. It's horrendous. He suffered a lot. He was skin and bones, almost dead when he left. And he suffered for the rest of his life. He did. He had a disability, ended up being basically an invalid much later in his life. get around and stuff for years, but then later it just caught up with him. But I think all these threads came together. Instead of on my grandmother's dad's side of the family, they took some stories that were from her mother's side of the family and reapplied them to the father's side of the story. Or on her father's side. And I think it just kind of found its own life. Now, I was able to tear apart that story and look at every thread. You know, where did this piece come from? Where did that piece come from? And that's what you have to do. You know, it's still a great story, and I'll still write it down, but I'll say this has been disproven, you know, that this was the family war. There are certain things that most people have on their hit list. This is what I would call a hit list anyway. Things people want to find in their family tree. Like oh boy, I found an ancestor on the Mayflower. I need to find somebody who served in the Civil War. Those are all out there, and they're all important, but not everybody's going to find them. I've found all of those except for maybe one or two. Yeah, I didn't find anybody who signed the Declaration of Independence. But there are others in addition to this that people try to find to, you know, oh, I want my link to history, you know, and that's great. Like I said, you can find most of these. I have ancestors that came in that tile side, but I also had an ancestor on the Mayflower. You know, that's just, you know, those great things you find along the way. But don't go looking for them. Don't go trying to prove that somebody that was on the Mayflower is your ancestor unless there's a real serious reason that you're looking at that. Okay, don't go and just try to plug somebody in through tenuous, weird, yeah. So, oh, I saw DNA research. This is kind of the third leg of your research stool. Have other people, I know there's a couple of you that have done it. Other people have done their DNA? Yeah, oh, about half, yeah. Very cool. There's a lot of different ways to get tested, a lot of different companies out there. It can help you identify your nationality, racial background, that sort of thing. It continues to evolve. You'll see one time you look at it, it says you're 32% English, and the next time it says 31% English, 1% Scottish, or something like that. And that's just as they get a bigger testing sample. The more and more people that get into it, the better they're able to kind of winnow out different percentages and that kind of thing to assign people to smaller and smaller groups. So the bigger the body of people involved in the test you choose, the better, if you want that kind of accuracy. It can be a source of unknown matches. You also can find they have their cousin matches, their DNA cousin matches that you can look at, and these are people that you're related to through DNA. And you can contact them and say, okay, how are we related? You know, that kind of thing. So, very cool. These are really valuable for people with true brick walls. Now, yes, sir.
Is there a safe DNA research? Because I've told our kids not to spit into a cup. Because once you send that off to that company, you have no idea what they're going to do with it.
Right.
And so, I mean, in that case,
the big companies have pretty extensive disclaimers about these are the things we will and won't do with your DNA. I do know that there have been some famous cases where they cooperated with law enforcement to help find serial killers and stuff. And I say go for it. If you want to use my DNA to help find a serial killer, go for it. I know it's not me, so it better not be.
but once you submit your DNA, you have no control over what's done with that.
It's there, yeah. And if you're not comfortable with it, don't do it.
Yeah.
You know, that's what I always tell people. I have submitted mine to 3 different companies. And I figure, you know, I sign an agreement with them, how they're gonna use it, and what I expect of that. And so I've done that. And it's been very helpful in my genealogy. I've been able to find, you can search by by location, which people are related to you in a certain area. You know, and if you know you have family that came from that area and you're questioning that maybe that person's related to you through that line, There's a lot of ways it benefits you. There's people out there though who will not do it, and I don't fault them for that, I just say, don't do it, you know.
What if somebody unscrupulous gets a hold of your DNA?
That
What do you deal
recently,
with? How do you deal with that?
23andMe had a huge data breach. They don't know who did it. They aren't even sure why they did it, because the information they took is just raw DNA information. You're not identified as a person in any of these records. It's a number that's attached to your DNA. And then that number's attached to your file that you set up and have your own passcode and stuff. They're not even sure why they took it, except maybe to try to find a backdoor way into people's accounts, you know, and get people's emails and all those other things that they already get you with all their other scams that they do. Yeah, they're not sure why that happened. I guess 23andMe has plummeted in their usership since then. And I did 23andMe a long time ago, 12, 15 years ago probably. Ancestry is the other one, and that's the biggest one. They have the biggest database. There's 24 million people, I think, that have tested through Ancestry.com around the world. 23andMe is the second largest. I think they have like 11 or 12 million people. So that's how much bigger Ancestry is than any of the others. Yeah, you can find all kinds of surprises. Plus, you can find indisputable evidence. You know, if you have somebody and you both have the same person on your tree, and you show a DNA link, and it can't be from any place else, that's indisputable evidence right there of your descent from that person. So, yeah, there's all these different companies that are out there. I've done 2 of them. Now, MyHeritage DNA will allow you to download your raw data from one of the other tests and upload it to theirs. The other tests won't cooperate with each other that way. So I've downloaded mine and added it to MyHeritage as well. So I have it on 3 different spots, and each one has their own cousin matches, and each one has their own breakdown of your heritage, you know, that geographical heritage and that kind of thing. So basically, it'll be a spit tube or a cheek swab. You mail it in. You log in on the computer and make an account, basically, with Ancestry or whatever. You get your results in a month. You get an email saying your results are done. Here's a link, and it'll take you into your Ancestry account or whatever, and then you can see your results. Check back with them frequently, because they do change. Like I said, the percentages and stuff adjust and move a little bit, or sometimes one will completely disappear and it'll get absorbed by a couple of neighboring ones. So, you can also see your inheritance from your parents. It'll tell you this is from parent 1 and parent 2. Ancestry will. I think the other ones are starting to come out with this too. But Ancestry will say this is the DNA you got from one parent, this is from the other. And usually if you have parents that have differing backgrounds, you can tell which parent that is. Keep in mind that you get 50% of each of your parents' DNA. So they have 100% of their DNA, you get half of it. But you don't know which half you got. That's why your siblings can look differently or be taller or shorter or whatever, because nobody gets the exact same 50%. You get 50% from your dad, 50% from your mom, and that's all that will show on this test. The only way you can know for sure what their full DNA spectrum is to have them test. You know, if you still have that parent with you, I encourage you to get that test done if you're interested in DNA testing. So, I got my mom tested 12 years ago. My dad passed away this summer, and I had a test. Had him tested about 6 months before that, so I was able to get that before he passed away. And now I can go back and look at, because he has a whole array of people that don't show up on my test, because they're from that other 50% that I didn't get. So, it identifies your DNA cousins. They all kind of call it different. Ancestry calls it DNA cousins. MyHeritage calls it that. But these are people that are related to you through DNA. And they will link their tree and your tree and say, here's possible common ancestor, that kind of thing. It's really cool. You can do through lines, which is where you go to a certain ancestor in your tree, and you look at everybody who claims descendancy from them that you have DNA matches to. And then that really makes it straightforward to say, okay, I'm looking for this person that descended from, Elisha Aldrich. And see if we're related, that kind of thing. They also have the medical and traits to different extents. Some of them you have to pay a little extra for a full medical breakdown or trait breakdown, but for the most part, you'll see some cute little things there that say, oh, this is why most people in your group don't like garlic or whatever. This is, you're 57% more likely to have curly hair, that kind of stuff.
Not funny.
So, if you want to do more research, this is more about away from DNA. This is back to general research. Look deeper online. Some of these are your most common areas that we all search. Ancestry.com has 30 billion records in their database with a B. Family Search has 16 billion. Now, a lot of those are repeated between them. They both have census records, that kind of thing. But they also have individual records that the other doesn't. Fold 3, again, that's primarily military records. It has some land records in there too. They have over 700 million records in that. That's owned by Ancestry. Newspapers.com, look at that, 924 million pages from almost 25,000 newspapers from around the world, mostly from the U.S. That's it, owned by Ancestry.com. So it's a paid thing. Library of Congress, though, has their own newspaper thing. I mentioned this earlier, Chronicling America. They have their own newspaper database with images of newspapers. It's searchable. You can type in a search. It'll search, use an OCR, optical character reader, and it'll search through all the PDFs that they have and see if they can find that name or place or whatever it is you're searching for. The National Archives. There's so many different sort of sites out there that I could do a whole presentation just naming sites. One that I always recommend is Cindy's List. Cindy's List, CYNDI, Cindy's List. And it is kind of just a warehouse, a clearinghouse of genealogy. She's been doing her site for many, many years, and you can search by state, you can search by event, like birth, death, that kind of thing. And all she does is just put on different links to different websites that might have information in that category. So it's really helpful. We do hold our genealogy work group, sponsored by the Sturgis and Meade County Historical Society and the Sturgis Public Library, right here, the first Saturday of each month at 1 o'clock. And March 2nd, we will be looking at researching military records. So this last time we looked at using the Family Search website and how to do all the different opportunities, I guess, that are in there. We've done different ones, though, on photo storage and scanning. We did another on how to write a story, how to gather information and then actually write a story about somebody. We've done a whole array of them, and most of those are on our webpage for the Historical Society, or our YouTube page. So go to the Sturgis and Meade County Historical Society's YouTube page, and most of those are there. You can watch those. But we encourage you to come. Everyone's welcome. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything? Yes, sir.
I have a comment, and I'm on the other side. I went in and I knew my grandparents, Sharpen, Curtis, Fitch, and Vetcher. They came all 6 of 8 of my great grandparents came from the same township in Germany. They migrated to the same township in Minnesota. They all knew each other in
Yeah.
Germany.
Yep.
So The only one was my dad's grandparent, came from northeast of Hamburg instead of 20 miles southeast of Hamburg. So it's pretty boring.
Yeah, not a lot of diversity there. Well, and when you look at it, you go back to your 18th grade grandparent, there's definitely not gonna be 1,000,000+ people.
Well,
And your family's gonna do this a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying first cousins
And
or
I
anything like that.
kind of knew some of this before because my dad and mom went over to the 400th anniversary of the Fitchen clan owning the same farm
Oh, wow.
in Germany. And it's still in the Fitchen name over there.
So
at
no
this point in
castle.
time. And they had a reunion for the 400th. My parents went over and my brother and his wife went over to that. And they said when they drove around the roads, they could see mailboxes with Sharpen, Curtis, still there.
All the family's still there.
So it's really boring.
Well, yes and no. You won't have to travel too far to go do all your research. Well, and you never know what surprises you might find too. You know, a generation before that, maybe somebody moved into that area from way back or something.
Yeah.
My mother, her
I haven't found
heritage.
that yet. I'm up to above that. And
They're still all there. Yeah. My mother, both her parents were Germans from Russia. My grandpa was born in Russia and came when he was less than a year old to the U.S. And then my grandmother was born in the U.S. a couple years after they arrived here, her family. So 100% German from Russia, right? Well, my mom did her DNA, and my aunt did hers. And no, not 100% German. Because, you know, that was always the thing. All these Germans went to Russia. They all stayed together, then they all came over here.
And the
She-
Vikings went everywhere.
Yeah. Well, my mother, you know, is still like 90-some% German.
Yeah.
But there's little slivers of
Oh, yeah.
Spain and Greece and all these little tiny dots of things. 0.5%, 1% of this and that. And I still got to figure out where that comes from, you know. Another thing about modern sensibilities that I was going to mention is, you know, that kind of thing. You know, where did that DNA come from? Because it doesn't fit in the records. And everybody jokes about mailman, milkman, you know, that kind of thing, traveling salesman. And we got to remember that in that day and age, the role of women was a lot different. And there's a strong chance it wasn't always a consensual dalliance. But you wouldn't have talked about those days. If it happened, you just keep your mouth shut and go about your business because you're the one that's going to be at fault for it.
And
So,
it wasn't a grown-up grandmother either, or
Yeah.
a grown-up, you know.
yeah. So, yeah, there's little things that we, you know, again, our modern sensibility is that, you know, that stuff gets recorded and all this. But, you know, there was a time where things were different, you know, and the role of women were very different. And you just, if there's some blip in the family tree, yeah. It's interesting to talk about and stuff, and it's kind of fun to speculate, but, you know, the whole role of the milkman or something might take on a different aspect, so,
Our
yeah.
father had the story, I mean, you know, that George Wood, who he thought was his father, wasn't his father.
Okay,
A man by the name of George McIntyre was his real father. And we don't know that that's actual. I don't know that he knew that it was actual.
mm-hmm,
You know, but that's something that we'd really like to
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
discover, to find. Because I would love to follow the McIntyre line if it's true,
mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah, because you can actually, in most, like in Ancestry, you can go in and say, biological father
Uh-huh.
and stepfather, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or adopted father, or whatever. You can list both and have them listed as different,
Oh,
under
okay.
different circumstances, you
Yeah.
know. So it gives you an opportunity to do that.
Yeah,
You know,
that'd be good.
it's really versatile now.
Yeah.
You know, these software programs are really something.
Mhm.
You can do a lot of really cool stuff. If we had time, I'd go through all of them, but we'll do that at one of our genealogy work groups.
All right.
Because we did that with Family Search, and I want to do one with Ancestry at some point. I know most people have used Ancestry, but there's so many different things on Ancestry's family of different things, you know, their Find a Grave and newspapers.com and all those things that, you know, it's worth a special session on that, I think. So,
Kind of off the wall. The McClellan that you mentioned in here,
Mhm.
did you know that, I think it's the same one, they had a saddle named after it?
yeah, they did. Saddle, that was used by the cavalry for
I had one,
many
it was
years.
wonderful.
Yeah, I had that split up the middle.
So they could travel long
Mm-hmm.
distances for
Allowed the back,
many,
it didn't
many
put as
hours.
much weight right on the spine, and,
Right.
you know, I've
It's
never
truly
used
comfortable.
it, but I've heard
Truly
a lot
comfortable.
about it. Yeah, and that was named after him. He was the president, commander of the Army of the Potomac early in the war. And he's the one that loved his troops so much that he refused to use them. You know, President Lincoln finally said, enough, go. And he started, he went a few miles and he camped again. And I can't attack them. We have 30,000 men and they have 300,000. Well, they didn't, they had 3,000, you know. But he never would use his men. He loved them so much. And that ended up finally costing him his job. And later in the war, you had, you know, Grant, who his job was to win the war. And he was accused of, you know, basically just using his men as fodder, throwing them into the enemy. It's like, that's what you do when you win a war, you know. So, went from one extreme to the other. Although a lot of the dark stories about General Grant and General Sherman and General Sheridan and all of those come from a point of history that was written after Reconstruction ended. And the national narrative was allowed to be controlled by Confederate veterans and the Confederate wives of and daughters of the Confederate veterans. They wrote a lot of the narrative about the Civil War. Well, in their eyes, you know, General Grant was a monster. He must have been a drunk to do some of the things he did. He must have not cared about his men, you know, that kind of thing. And that plays a lot into what we hear today about some of these generals and stuff.
You know, when you said something about newspaper.com, reminded me, I just got an email that newspaper.com, you can use it for free this weekend, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Now, I don't know whether they target some people and send an email
Huh?
to some that, you know, have used it
Well, it's
periodically, or if it's for everybody,
Check it
but,
out.
you know, if you want
It's
to look
worth
into
going
it.
on and trying to use it if you don't already have the membership. Because there's some great stuff.
Yeah, there is.
You find amazing stuff in that.
And because Monday's a holiday, it's Saturday, Sunday, Monday.
There you go.
So guess what I'm
Newspapers.com.
gonna do when I get home?
I bet you're gonna do some gardening.
Do some gardening.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
thanks. I want to make a couple of comments. Couple of things that I think is really important that I learned with my dad in particular, and that is, and Mark mentioned it, is recording people talking. An opportunity lost on my part. You don't think about it until, I didn't think about it until it was all done. We had a rummage sale, garage sale, and we were going through stuff in the garage, downsizing, and Dad was telling stories. I mean, he told me about this and about this. At the end of the day, it was like, why didn't I have my camera out there? I lost it all. Would have been a wonderful, wonderful resource. Flip side, I go to Believers Fellowship, and we lost our building to a fire. And my dad was instrumental in building just about every square inch of that building. Lesson learned, we brought him out there this summer to look at the foundation. And I had my camera, and he told stories, and I got that. So, just, you know, if you have a digital recorder or a camera, or most of our phones have stuff on it anymore, throw it in the middle of the table and let people talk. And you might want to let them know that you got, maybe have a recording, but you might, some people might get shy too, but I think it's a tremendous resource for, and you might get some of those embellished stories in there too, but.
But there, again, those embellished stories have value.
Right, right.
You
and
just
can always
can't take them as scripture either, you know?
Right, no, but you can take some of the truths to them
Yeah.
and find.
Because I bet everybody in here has a story that they don't know if it's true or not. You know, that's, you know, I have the presentation come up in April about the 109th Engineers, POWs. My granduncle, Bill Caton, he was one of those POWs. And I remember him, and I even have a picture of me sitting with him at a 4th of July picnic, listening to him telling stories about that. And he didn't talk about it a lot, but once he got going, he was a grand storyteller. That guy, and he could embellish a story like nobody you ever met. And he'd just go and go and go. And he started talking about all these attempts he made to escape and how he kept getting caught and taken back to the camp, and he'd be in solitary for a while. And then he'd get out and he'd wait an opportunity, he'd take it off again and all this stuff. And that's why I ended up writing that paper, was primarily to see, was Uncle Bill telling the truth? You know? Well, it turns out he was. But I ended up doing the whole paper was about all of those POWs, because I didn't want to just consume all the effort just on one person. But I was able to verify, yeah, he did try to escape several times. You know, and that wasn't easy for somebody who's 6'8", you know, to wander through Germany trying to find his way to Switzerland. You know, he was easy to spot, so he'd get caught.